Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. A gentle reminder once again, please introduce yourself first before stating your question to our panelists during the Q&A. The moderator and the panelists for session 3 are now ready on stage to discuss the outlook for Thailand and Myanmar. This session will be moderated by Dr. Michael Montesano, Visiting Senior Fellow and Coordinator for the Myanmar and Thailand Studies Programs at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Dr. Michael Montesano, please.
Welcome to our first afternoon session, and I hope you all had a good lunch. I certainly did. With no further delay, we will start the session with our presentation from Matthew Wheeler, who's the Senior Analyst for Southeast Asia at the International Crisis Group, who will be speaking on the fate of Thai-style democracy.
Thank you, Michael. What I'm going to do with my time here this afternoon is talk about the political order that Thailand's military regime has created. We can call it a form of Thai-style democracy. And I'm also going to speculate a little bit about how this new order may function or perhaps malfunction. So that term, Thai-style democracy, was coined in the 1950s to describe the dictatorship of Field Marshal Sarit Thanarat, which of course was not a democracy in any sense at all. The phrase, though, came to represent the notion that Thailand wasn't ready for democracy and so needed a strong leader that could respond to the needs of the people in the way a good father will respond to the needs of his children. The phrase made a bit of a comeback after the 2006 coup. There was an effort to make Thai-style democracy respectable again. And on the face of it, I mean, it seems like a reasonable idea, the notion that a political system should reflect the society in which it operates. In practice, though, Thai-style democracy has been a euphemism for authoritarianism and paternalism. I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on how we got to this point in Thai history. Back in November 2012, almost a year and a half after Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra took office, a retired general named Bunlet Gelprasit and some of his friends and allies called for a coup d'etat. They said at the time that their aim was to freeze Thailand. General Bunlet said, "We need to topple this government and freeze democracy for 5 years in order to begin real political reforms." The idea was there would be no elections for 5 years, and that would allow a period of genuine political reform that would in turn allow true democracy to flourish in Thailand. At the time, even Yingluck's fiercest critics thought that this was sort of a crazy idea being put forward by political dinosaurs. But lo and behold, in May 2014, the military did stage a coup, ostensibly to put an end to chaos on the streets of Bangkok. That was carried out by protesters who were under the banner of reform before elections. Once in power, the National Council for Peace and Order, the NCPO, promised reform. And this idea that was once outlandish, that there would be a deep freeze of democracy in Thailand, no elections for 5 years, has become the reality in Thailand. Now, it was clear at the time of the coup in 2014 that it was going to be different from the coup of 2006. Opponents of Thaksin Shinawatra looked at the 2006 coup as a wasted opportunity. So the coup makers of 2014 were determined not to waste their opportunity to reshape Thailand's political order. And nobody can accuse them of rushing the job. They've hinted at and promised general elections at least 4 times in the past, maybe 5 now. We still don't know exactly when a general election will take place. So what has the NCPO achieved in terms of political reform? I think true to the general pattern of constitution drafting in Thailand, they haven't established impartial institutions. They haven't created a level playing field. What they've done, and this is the general pattern for Thai constitutions, is to create a system that will consolidate their own power. They've sought to create a political order in which they can control the consequences of popular elections. And they've done this primarily through the 2017 Constitution. There are many provisions which serve this purpose. There's the mixed member proportional voting system, which favors smaller parties and disadvantages the large established parties, Pheu Thai and the Democrat Party. There's a fully appointed Senate. All 250 members are appointed, mostly selected in a rather opaque process by committees that are handpicked by the NCPO. There's also the possibility in the first 5 years of having an unelected prime minister, or what they call an outsider prime minister. There are broad powers for the so-called independent agencies like the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the Election Commission, et cetera. Broad powers as well for the judiciary, which has ruled reliably against Thaksin Shinawatra and his parties since 2006. And there's really no mechanisms to make these independent agencies accountable to the public in any way. The Constitution is also extremely difficult to amend. And on top of all this, there's the 20-year national strategy, the stated aim of which is to make Thailand a high-income country by 2037. And it sets out fairly narrow parameters for policy that elected governments must follow on pain of impeachment, including potentially for cabinet ministers 10 years in jail if they're found to fall afoul of this 20-year strategy. So to sum up the Constitution, it offers a system that's really designed to separate politics from policy. It turns Parliament into a sandbox where elected politicians can tinker on the margins of policy but never set policy. And really the whole thing seems designed to offer pretexts for the junta, in whatever form it takes after an election, to get rid of elected governments of which it does not approve. Now, I, among others, have commented in the past that the nearest comparison to the NCPO's preferred political system would look something like the so-called semi-democracy of the 1980s. That was when General Bremden Sulinon was the prime minister, an unelected prime minister, who presided over unstable coalition governments. There was a Senate that operated like the bureaucratic military party, and elected politicians would squabble over the spoils of office, but without ever really impinging on policymaking. It's not a perfect analogy. Times have changed, and the junta is aware of that as well. But I think still, in broad strokes, we can say that this political order is a throwback to a form of Thai-style democracy. Powerful appointed Senate, potentially an unelected prime minister, heavy constraints on politicians, preservation of military prerogatives, and all of this underpinned by a conviction that popular sovereignty is dangerous and has to be contained. So what's different now from the period when Thai-style democracy held sway? The economy is an obvious difference. In the 1980s, GDP was growing at double digits year after year. Obviously, that's not the case any longer. But I think probably more important is that the Thai voters are not the same. They're better educated, they're better informed than they used to be. And not only that, most Thai voters have had the experience of voting for a party and a platform that resulted in positive change in their lives. And I think for many of them, this is indelible. I also think that in a lot of the discussion about Thailand's political future, the voters don't figure prominently enough. Another difference, of course, is the monarchy is not the same. We have a different king, a new king. who has demonstrated that he's willing to exercise the authority that he has more actively than did his father. To what end, no one can say for sure. So one interesting parallel, I think, to Thailand's political past is the establishment of a pro-military party, the Palang Pracharat Party, which has been formed in part with politicians who were poached from existing parties, including the Thaksin-aligned Pheu Thai Party. And this echoes the pro-military Samakitam Party, which won the March 1992 election, despite receiving fewer votes than the New Aspiration Party, and which nominated General Suchinda Kraprayun to become prime minister. And of course, all of this presaged the events that became known as Black May in 1992. Now, returning to Palang Pracharat, there are reports that politicians were offered money to jump ship from their existing parties to the pro-military party. There are also reports that some politicians who had court cases pending against them were offered some sort of clemency if they jumped ship. These were also techniques used by Samakitam. We should also note that the NCPO has been de facto political campaigning for the past year or more through mobile cabinet meetings around the country. They've been courting provincial strongmen and godfathers, influential figures in the provinces that they feel can deliver votes. And I think we should note the contrast between this sort of activity and the high-minded rhetoric of the NCPO and their stance against the venality of politicians. It shows a great deal of pragmatism on their part. So what happens after an election? This brings us to a paradox of the 2017 Constitution. When the popular vote becomes unfrozen and people have a chance to cast votes, I think the election results will actually have some significance in spite of the fact that the system is designed to minimize the impact of the popular vote. So I think we need to distinguish between the election results, which is who gets how many votes, and the election outcome, which is who gets to form the government and who becomes prime minister. In a real sense, this election, when it finally happens, is going to be a referendum on the junta and on 5 years of military rule. And it's going to shape the way people across the country perceive the political landscape and the question of who has legitimacy to govern. So can the junta and its allied parties win enough seats to select a prime minister and form a government? The received wisdom is that they only need 126 seats in the lower house, combined with the votes from the Senate that will allow them to select a prime minister. But there's a school of thought that suggests that the way the Senate votes on this issue is going to be conditioned to some extent by the result of the popular vote. That is, senators, even appointed senators, will find it difficult to go against the will of a majority of voters. And what about the anti-junta political parties? Can they put aside their differences and form a coalition? Again, the answer, I think, depends on the election results. With 255 seats, the anti-junta parties can form a government. But if Palang Pracharat does well, winning, say, 60 or 70 seats, it'll be easier for them to entice other parties, perhaps in particular the Democrat Party, to join them in a coalition government. But if Palang Pracharat is rebuffed by the voters, then their position becomes much weaker. It'll be much more difficult for them to form a government. And this is another paradox of the 2017 Constitution. A pro-military party is going to need to do a lot of horse trading, a lot of deal making in order to form a government. And this, of course, is conducive to money politics. But even if the junta is able to form a government, it's going to be saddled with the constitutional constraints that it constructed and an elected lower house. Prayut is going to, if he becomes prime minister again, he's going to have to do it without the benefit of Article 44, which allows him to rule by decree. He's going to have to maintain a coalition of elected politicians. He's going to have to deal with a less compliant media. And there are real questions about how he would be able to pass a budget, for example, or deal with a vote of no confidence. So he could be in for a rough ride if indeed he becomes prime minister. So I think the effort to take Thailand back to an imagined past where an unelected prime minister is able to govern with the help of the military and upstanding senators and govern a docile and grateful population is really doomed. I don't think that's the way it's going to work in the 21st century. But it still remains to be seen how Thailand is going to achieve a consensus on political legitimacy. That's something that Thai people have to work out. And unfortunately, the 2017 Constitution doesn't really give them the tools to do it. So I'm going to stop there. I'd like to thank you all for listening and thank ICES for the invitation.
To address Myanmar with the question, wave or eddy, analysis of democratic transition in Myanmar, we have U Min Zin. Sir.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the organizer to invite me for this event. Let me start my presentation with a PowerPoint. My outline, basically I'll give you an overview of the recent update in Myanmar, and I'll give you 5 different trends I can outline. First, in the peace process. The second, in the economy and development. The third, democratization, rule of law, and human rights. And the fourth will be civil-military relations. Fifth will be Rakhine Rohingya crisis. And I will touch on some recommendations that are highly relevant to these trends. First and foremost, let me start with good news, which is, we can say, progress during the NLD administration. We had a new president in March 2018. The President Win Myint replaced the previous president, U Tin Jaw. The new president somehow brought energy to the office in some respects. But at the same time, we should be reminded what Daw Aung San Suu Kyi said in the get-go, which is, I will be above the president. So in somehow, president is still more active, more energetic, but still, when compared to state councillor, the one who called the shot is the state councillor, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. So the new president launched 2 campaigns. One is anti-corruption, another one is anti-narcotic. It's very difficult. In terms of outcome, it's remained to be seen, but he injected lots of energy and hopes in the societies. The second thing is recent transfer of General Administration Department, which was under the Home Ministry. Home Minister was appointed, nominated, to appoint by the military. So people was quite hopeful because now this GAD, which is very powerful, which affects people's daily life, is being transferred from the military control ministry to more like civilian-run ministry. I said civilian-run because the 2 ministers who run the ministry that oversee the GAD is former militaries. So it's hard to say they are military or former military in terms of appointments. So that's the one thing. And then the third is the new president's travel around different regions, put more pressure on the chief ministers to be more sensitive to the plights of the ordinary people. So that's also being appreciated by the Myanmar citizen. Another one is, less good news, which is deadlock in the peace process. Daw Aung San Suu Kyi vowed that she will build the Democratic Federal Union with that through the peace process. So, but that peace process, what she called 21st century Panlong peace process, seemed to be right now in the deadlock. The two major ethnic groups who signed the nationwide ceasefire, Karen and Shan, announced recently that they will suspend their participation in the peace process, either through joint monitoring of the ceasefire or in the political process. So that's the two most powerful group. Suspension from the process has a huge impact on the peace process. And also the Damodar, the military, imposed that on the ethnic armed groups, if you want to have self-determination, meaning if you want to draft your own state constitution, you have to accept non-secession. You have to accept explicitly non-secession and one army in this country. So that's a like kind of package D. So that's ethnic armed groups having a hard time to agree upon. So that's how the peace process has been the deadlock. Another one is Rakhine crisis, and the government handling of the crisis make Myanmar more and more into like pariah internationally. And also that drive Myanmar into the Chinese embrace. You can see more and more Chinese assertiveness in the Myanmar foreign policy crisis. And the last one is you would see, ironically, more weak, democratic and federal commitment during this civilian government. So the last point is, I think 2020 elections seem to be very critical. It clouds a lot of politics and issues in Myanmar right now. People, whatever you want to talk about, Rakhine or peace or economy, I think you cannot remove the impact or influence or anticipation what will happen in 2020 general election. In terms of peace, I think that we all might agree on that. The underlying problem in Myanmar is incomplete nation building. The military dictatorship in parts since '62 complicated and compounded the problem. So unless you address this nation building issue in this multi-ethnic society, it's very difficult to see any pragmatic outcome. So the deadlock in the peace process is for two reasons. One is among the key stakeholders, there are different visions, especially between Tamil and ethnic armed groups. For the ethnic armed groups, they see this peace process as a way to build a new nation, kind of more like coming together type of nation building. For the Tamil, it's more like minimalist. You come and talk to us, what do you want? If your demand is flexible, is reasonable enough, we are flexible to accommodate your demand. We will change, amend constitutions. And then you disarm, you join political parties, or you set up political parties, and you run for the elections. That's how Tamil see this peace process. For the armed groups, they see as a very big nation-building project. So these two competing or different visions could not help them to address these problems in the peace process. And again, because of 2020 elections, all these key players who entertain electoral ambitions, they're not willing to share any political credit with each other. If something particular happened, some people like in the Tamil might think, oh, the NLD leaders, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, will take credit. And then on the other hand, something similar. So this is more or less more like political credit game. So people don't want to share any credit with their competing sides. The third, I think in this peace process, because of the moral authority and political strength of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, people tend to see which is kind of once and for all process, that's what resolve the country's problem. I think it would be more useful to see this as a cycle, because throughout, successive governments since independence, Myanmar governments try to reach peace agreement in their successive regime. Look at this table. You will see different cycles. I make like 7 cycles. So different types of negotiation, different condition. Different groups agreeing, disagreeing. So for us, because of that, different visions and 2020 elections, it seemed like this cycle of peace process seemed to be winding down. I would say we cannot see much substantive agreement and negotiation prior to the 2020 election. We can see probably more outcome after the 2020 election. So trends in economy, MSDP in the 2018, IMF said this is a good step, but many people inside Burma still think this is still on the paper. It's nothing being, implemented in real life. And the new investment law and company law, in the hopes of giving like more access to permits and tax holidays, tax break, but according to the World Bank, we are still 171 out of 190 economies in terms of easing the doing business index. And FDI flow is really down. I'll go like very quick because of the time. And then slow growth in 2018-19. So with these data, and at the same time, you have the perception of economy is not good among the people, among the businesses. That perception also bring you down more. So, and that's why people feel like a lot of burden with regard to taxation and other issues. So democratization, let me give you like, I think we always tend to think 3 kinds of departures. One is constitutional departure. To be fair to NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, I think that the 2008 constitution is not democratic. It's really gripping the NLD capacity to do a lot of things for the country. So in terms of constitutionally, the NLD could not make major departure, any departure from the past. But in terms of behavior, in terms of attitude, I think they can make departure from the past regimes, and we can see whether they do it or not. In terms of departure, I don't see much the new government, NLD government, has been doing good enough. You can see these cases. The use of telecommunication law to arrest people has been incredibly increased under the NLD government. Also, in terms of freedom of association, assembly, and procession, the arrest and crackdown rates are increasing under the civilian government and under the NLD government. So that's why Freedom House continue to put Myanmar as a category of not free. In terms of rule of law, Myanmar ranked 100 out of 113, and press freedom dropped 131 to 137. And there's a poster child case as like 2 writers, journalists, being like sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, and Aung San Suu Kyi defended, which is according to the due process, So that's nothing we can do so far. And so in terms of attitude and vision, I think the leadership, both Tambador and the civilian, failed to offer clear moral and political compass. Instead of that, they urged the people to follow the captain. So it seemed like you see the stand with Aung San Suu Kyi, stand with Tambador, mainly instead of urging us to follow what particular political and moral pathway, they just urge us to follow the captain. Just trust us, we will take care of you. So that's this kind of paternalistic and personalized leadership is at a disservice. We can see, in terms of erection of Aung San statues in the ethnic minority area is how is disservice to the ethnic reconciliations in Burma, Myanmar. And a narrow and extremely minimalist interpretation of democracy and democratic representation. We win the election. You know, if you want to criticize, compete as in the election. So this kind of attitude really marginalizes civil society, media, and other political parties who do not win election. And the third is a weak federal commitment. So I don't want to go very detailed. Mainly, the many ethnic minorities feel like they are not being treated, like well under the new government. So civil-military relations, I'm still puzzled whether it's a civil-military relations or civil military and retired military relations. Because in Myanmar case, many people who are not familiar with Myanmar would think, oh, Aung San Suu Kyi appointed many former military generals in their cabinet. Why military is not happy? I think in Myanmar case, the military in service always see military retire as, they betray us. So in '88 uprising, the military thinks the military leaders who were poached by Ne Win revenge us by using public protests. Now, those who ally with the Aung San Suu Kyi are being seen by the military as these guys are not, reliable. They know about us in and out, but now they take side with the opposition, so we don't trust them. So I think in Myanmar case, it's more like not civil-military relations, more like military and retired military relations seem to be more analyzed and steady. And another problem is overemphasized on the two governments concept, which is being promoted by Kofi Annan and as well as Michelle Yeoh recently in the New York Times interview. That's another issue because military tend to see they are being the NLD and its allies will throw the military under the bus. And another one is the democratic forces, including especially NLD, they focus too much on the military's Tamado's constitutional veto power rather than the Tamado's functional prerogative. Tamaro, if you have the violence and conflict in society, Tamaro's functional power has been increased. It doesn't matter you try to block the military in the parliament, you try not to convene National Defense and Security Council. It doesn't matter. So long as you have violence and conflict in the society, military's functional power has been increasing. So we have to be more strategic and understanding of this distinction. And Rakhine, this is mainly in the news, failed repatriation, and the ICC, and all these war crime investigation issues, and China role. I think because of Rakhine, Myanmar is more and more being driven to Chinese embrace, and with that China-Myanmar economic corridor, with the slow and decline in the investment from the West, I think Myanmar really desperate to lure Chinese investment in. And the worst thing is, because of that Rakhine issue, it creates a false dichotomy between, we Buddhists are being treated unfairly. Kind of self-righteous victimhood is a very prevailing thing in Burma, in Myanmar. So it's this kind of false dichotomy is really undermining liberal values and institutional building in Myanmar. Instead, that it helps people to think, oh, these liberals and Western allies are undermining us. So our true friends are China and Russia. So then, in a way, the public trust in the public institution, domestic as well as internationally, are being undermined. So quick recommendation. I think the sequence matter. If you save another big crisis in Rakhine and other leadership vacuum, I think it's important to pay more attention to economy first, then to make sure you have regular elections, and that the loser will honor the winners. That's very important. And then, if we manage to stabilize in these two, I think the peace will be more likely, because peace is a long term. I don't think you can really bring peace outcome right away. So in terms of civil-military relation, I think NLD government should activate the National Defense and Security Council which is the only platform where the civilians and the military can work together and cultivate better relationship. And pay attention to the temporal functional video. And peace process, I think it's important, even though there's a lot of flaws and issues to be discussed, but the nationwide ceasefire agreement should be maintained because this is the only institution, in addition to the 2008 constitution, that could bind the Tambador and other armed forces. And I think if we cannot make any advancement in the peace process through the nationwide ceasefire agreement, we should also encourage bilateral ceasefire agreement with the different armed ethnic groups because it helps both sides to address some of the humanitarian issues. And then the last one is we should have done like reconciliation or unity government in the 2015. Even though NLD won landslide, they should have come up with the more broad reconciliation government. I think like for 2020, it will be visionary for the leadership if they strive for more unity government in the aftermath of elections. Even though you win, I'm not talking about coalition government. You have a political will and determination to form broad-based unity government, especially by including ethnic minorities and some of the Tambador leadership in the government. Thank you.
We have just about 10 minutes for questions if we're going to stick to our schedule for the afternoon. So let me open the floor now. We have a question back here. We'll take 3 questions to start. One here, and we have a third. Okay, so, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mai. My name is Termsak. I belong to the ASEAN Studies Center. I'm also a Thai from Bangkok. My question is for Mr. Wheeler. Earlier, you mentioned that Thai voters now are different from than in the past. But later on, you indicated that we could see the return of money politics. So can you tell us a little bit more what your perception of Thai voters, especially those in the rural area? And a related question about Thai general election is, do you see any new significant role of social media in the upcoming general election? Do you expect to see any sudden Thailand political tsunami the way we saw in Malaysia? Thank you.
And for our second question, back here.
Hi, my name is Waikin. I'm with Channel News Asia. I'd like to ask U Min Zin, there have been various developments involving the Tambador, such as the recently announced 4 months truce, the trilateral talks among Min Aung Hlaing, Daw San Suu Kyi, and the EAOs, as well as, like you mentioned earlier, the GAD transfer of the transfer of GAD to civilian-run ministry. Can I ask your views on how you think the Myanmar military, the role or how it's portrayed itself, how that has evolved since NLD took power?
And Mo.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to both speakers, but my question is directed to Go Min Zin, Mo Duzar from the...
Could you raise your voice a touch?
Right. Thank you to both speakers. My question is directed to U Min Zin. My name is Mo. I'm with the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, and the question is about the very sober and realistic picture you painted with regard to Myanmar's future. I recall in 2016, you also talked about sequencing issues when ICS convened the Myanmar Forum 2016. And it's with regard to that point that I'd like to ask you to also gaze into your crystal ball, if you can, and maybe explain a bit more to the audience. In this sequencing of the economy, elections, and the peace, where does the ASEAN factor feature in all of this? Because for better or for worse, everything that pertains to Myanmar's external relations and projections are going to be refracted through the prism of the Rohingya crisis. And the previous administration seemed to have a more clear-cut ASEAN-first policy than the current administration, but I may be mistaken, so I would like to get your views on that. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we take those in order? The Thailand question first and then the two Myanmar questions.
Thank you for the question. I think one way to think about the idea of Thai voters as being susceptible to vote buying, well, I guess what I mean to say is I think when we talk about money politics, it doesn't necessarily mean the act of buying votes from voters. I think we can think about it in terms of buying politicians and buying parties. There have been studies done about the effectiveness of vote buying in Thailand, and my understanding is that it's not as effective as it used to be. That voters are motivated by policies to a much greater degree than they were in earlier decades. But that doesn't necessarily stop the practice. But my understanding is that voters are happy to take an envelope and then vote the way they want to vote. And then there's nothing preventing them from doing so. The question about social media is very interesting. I mean, two things come to mind. One is the YouTube video by the rap group, Rap Against Dictatorship, which when I checked, I think it was last week, it was something like 50 million views. That's a lot of views. And I don't know if you all have seen this video, but it demonstrates an awareness of Thailand's political history, and it really gives it to the junta. And so it suggests that perhaps Thailand's younger voters are not as apathetic as we tend to think. The other one is the Twitter hashtag that translate, I guess the most polite way we can translate it is delay my ass. So when the idea was that they're going to delay the election again, many people in the Twitter sphere were outraged and upset by this. And my understanding is that this hashtag was actually one of the top 10 in the world, so being referenced on Twitter at some point last week. But does this mean a political tsunami? I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, the truth is, there's a variety of political views in Thailand, and there are real divisions. People have their different preferences. But I think, I still think that the election is as I said, going to be a referendum on the junta. And I think it's possible that the result will show that Thai people, after 5 years, are ready for something different. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. The first one, Tamador, Commander-in-Chief, announced the unilateral truce from December 21st to the end of the April in 2019, so about 4 months. As far as I understand, until now, it's already been like 15% of, maybe when you calculate that, 15% of the whole entire 4 months. There's not much on ground, informal or formal engagement with the ethnic armed groups until now. They are planning to do after January 12 or 13, but until now, as far as I know from the ethnic armed groups, there's a little limited, almost like virtually none engagement on the ground. So the issue is, in terms of statement or statement politics, these are encouraging. But in terms of on-ground situation, you have to make these statements of unilateral truce. What does it mean for the different ethnic groups? What does it mean, how they're supposed to interpret, how they're supposed to implement? So I think it's a very important to see not just top-level announcement promising to do this and that, but also in terms of on-ground engagement need to be complemented. So that's one thing. Another thing, interesting thing is with this statement of unilateral truce or ceasefire in the 5 regional commands out of 14 regional commands in Myanmar, I think Tambador seemed to give a signal that it would be the Tambador who could make this country peace, who could call the shot. Because in the statements, there was no mention of 21st century Pyongyang even. So I think the extent of the statement truce is mainly to do with ceasefire rather than political solution. So to me, back to my own argument, it seemed like until the 2020 elections, I don't think you can expect much political resolution even through this unilateral truce. We can probably expect some kind of bilateral truce between Tambador and some ethnic armed groups, but I don't expect much of the political satisfaction or even let alone resolution out of this process. And another one, General Administration Department, GAD. This reform of this department was already conceived in the previous government, 2013-14. And the issue was previous government wanted to address the accountability issue, not just transferring department from one ministry to another. They, as far as I know, they were trying to change a particular constitutional clause that make this department appointed. Instead of appointment, they just want to do more local election for this department. So it was postponed because of 2015 election. Now, this initiative has been brought back again, but we have to see whether this is just a change of hand from the left hand to right hand, or is it intent to change fundamental accountability system in the General Administrative Department? With regard to Memo question, the role of ASEAN, yes, it's a puzzling. Many diplomats also told me it seems governments don't really, use all available options regionally as well as internationally. So it seemed like moving toward China is not mainly because of the structural constraint, such as Rakhine issue, but also it seemed to be your own creation because you are not savvy enough, to diversify, to bring supports from the ASEAN as well as other Western countries. Even the US diplomat from Washington, D.C. told me, you don't need much. Under the Trump administration, you just make minor concession, something like low-hanging fruit, feasible things. I think the Trump administration is willing to accommodate. So they're not much about human rights or democracy. It's more practical thing. Even you're not able to manage making Trump administration to accommodate you. It'll be more and more difficult in the future with regard to not much resolution in the Rakhine State and other human rights situation issues.
Well, sadly, we're already over time. So let's thank our 2 exceptionally thoughtful speakers for their presentations. Matt, that was terrific.